Hi, I'm Charles with Handicap. The story begins as a guy wakes up and is surprised to see that his hands are really small. He goes to look at his surroundings and finds that he's in some sort of giant kingdom. Just then a maid rushes to him because she's worried that he'll fall out the window. This kid's name is Vaughn, and he apologizes. The scenery outside was just too magnificent, and he was overwhelmed by its beauty. The maid is shocked to hear him speak like this, and she wonders where he learned such difficult words. She points out that he's only 2 years old, and this comes as a surprise to Vaughn. He's actually much older, so he wonders what's going on. He has vague memories of living in this place, so he wonders if this is that thing called reincarnation. Vaughn remembers that this maid is named Till, and his name is Vaughn Nefertio. His father is Marquise, and his older brothers are Mercia, Jard, and Sesto. Till is very impressed by his ability to say all their full names at his age, but Vaughn just wants to know where he is right now. As the entire family enjoys breakfast, we see that everyone is very tense and serious. Vaughn, on the other hand, isn't anything like his brothers, and the maids all think he's adorable. He is eating his vegetables like a good boy, and the maids compliment him for being so good at chewing his food. They absolutely adore him, so Vaughn feels like he's a VIP at some kind of hostess club. Vaughn then puts all the jokes aside to review his current situation. It seems that he's been reborn in this new world, but his memories of his time in Japan are still intact. Just then, we see just how serious Marquise is as he asks Jard what he will be studying today. Jard immediately responds by saying that he will be learning about fire magic and battle formations. Marquise has the same question for Sesto, so Sesto responds that he will be studying magic. Marquise then turns to Vaughn to hear what he will be doing, but his answer is a bit different. Vaughn explains that there are a lot of things he doesn't know, so he was thinking of starting by studying their nation's culture and history. This instantly shocks all of his brothers, and Marquise can't help but laugh. He thought that he had been spoiling Vaughn since he was the last child of his late wife Mura, but he's happy to see that at just 2 years old, Vaughn is already a fine young man. Marquise is very pleased with his growth, and he's positive that Vaughn will possess powerful fire magic like Mira and himself. Marquise says that the family's future is in good hands, and he looks forward to Vaughn's magical aptitude appraisal when he turns 8. Marquise then gets very serious and declares that he has high hopes for Vaughn. Vaughn then thinks about how apparently a person's magical aptitude is very important in this world. Their offensive capabilities make them useful for protecting people, so nobles desire one of the 4 elemental magics. These 4 are fire, water, wind, and earth. Those with aptitude for other types of magic that don't fit into those 4 are seen as a disgrace. As for his family, Marquise and all of Vaughn's brothers possess one of the 4 elemental magics. A while later, we see that Vaughn has really taken an interest in this nation's culture during his studying. He is looking at a map, and he wonders if a nearby port is the only one where ships can sail from. Till says it is, because huge monsters lurk in the deep ocean, and the ships would come under attack if they sailed from anywhere else. Vaughn can't get enough of this new information, so he wonders what kind of races exist in this world. Till begins to list all the different kinds, like elves and dwarves, but she's interrupted by the other maids. They point out that this is all too complicated for a 2-year-old to learn, so Till apologizes. Vaughn tells her that it's no problem, and he was asking her because he wants to learn everything he can. He has become interested in something else, so he asks Till to teach him about magic tools. Till begins by explaining that magic crystals, gemstones, plus some rocks and ores can all store magic. Because of this, people can make magic tools related to their magic aptitude with them. The maids are amazed to see Vaughn absorbing all this information because he's still just 2 years old. Just then, their little lesson is interrupted by the butler named Esparta. Esparta acknowledges that Vaughn is currently 2 years old and is learning to read and do basic numeracy. That isn't enough for Esparta though, as he wants to find out exactly how much Vaughn really knows. Vaughn takes a look at this guy and thinks about how Esparta is a talented butler who has apparently been in his father's services for many years. This guy seems pretty dependable, but Vaughn can't help but think about how he can be really scary sometimes. Vaughn quietly says that his reading isn't so good, so Esparta wants to hear about his numeracy skills. Again, Vaughn speaks softly and explains that he can do a little addition and subtraction. Esparta doesn't waste any time, and he gives him a quick test. He raises a few of his fingers and instructs Vaughn to tell him how many fingers he's holding up. Vaughn correctly counts 5 of them, and everyone patiently waits to see what Esparta says. Esparta then declares that he will become Vaughn's tutor, and Vaughn is horrified. The lessons begin immediately, but they're absolutely brutal. Esparta never takes it easy on Vaughn, but thanks to these tough lessons, Vaughn is able to learn how to read and write in just a few weeks. Vaughn often wonders if this kind of studying is even okay for a 2-year-old, but it eventually helps him to learn a lot of stuff. Vaughn then spent the next 2 years studying from dawn to dusk, and eventually he turned 4 years old. We now see him training swordsmanship with Till, but he's no match for her. Till wins like she always does, but Vaughn has had enough of her taunting him. The other maids scold her, as they point out that Till must not value her life for her to be taunting Lord Vaughn like that. They insist that Vaughn punish her, but Vaughn says that he doesn't mind how she treats him. The other maids refuse to accept that, because normally it would be a serious crime for someone to be so rude to a noble. Vaughn acknowledges that this is just one of those obligations he has as a noble, so he prepares to punish Till for her insolence. Till screams in terror as she gets ready, but Vaughn just ends up flicking her in the head. The other maids implore him to do more, but Vaughn declares that the matter is settled. Till can't believe that he spared her, and Vaughn just gives her a reassuring smile. Vaughn then studied swordsmanship every single day, and by the time he was 5, he was able to fight on equal terms with the older soldiers in training. As Vaughn spars with one, he thinks about the fighting style of his opponents. He usually fights other children, so their attacks tend to be simplistic. Vaughn's experience from his past life makes a huge difference, so he's able to beat the soldiers in training easily. After demolishing the kid he was just sparring with, the other trainees say that Lord Vaughn is really amazing. They can't believe that Vaughn is really good with a sword, on top of all his other talents, and they call him a real prodigy. Vaughn is also very kind-hearted, as he helps the kid up. This amazes the others as well, because unlike Jard and Sesto, Vaughn talks to them, despite their lower status. As Vaughn takes a break, he is met by the deputy commander, named D. D takes a look at Vaughn's hands, and he's amazed because Vaughn doesn't have any calluses. He thought that Vaughn was sword training every night, so he expected his hands to be in rougher shape, but that is not the case. Vaughn explains that he can't train his swordsmanship as much as he wants because his studies take up all of his time. D then reveals that Vaughn has been studying so much because the Sparta was ordered to make Vaughn study 3 times harder than anyone else. Vaughn is shocked because he had no idea, but it all makes sense now. He thought it was odd that he was the only one studying from morning to night, and now he knows why. D assumes that Vaughn would rather be learning about the sword, so he says that if he wants to train more, then he will plead his case for him. He calls Sparta an egghead, and he says that the egghead is too devoted to academic subjects. D doesn't want that for Vaughn, so he declares that he should pursue the path of the sword instead. He vows to teach Vaughn everything he knows so that he can become the nation's greatest swordsman. This guy's way over the top with everything he says, but the look in his eyes tells Vaughn that he is dead serious. Vaughn settles him down by explaining that while he does like the sword, he also likes studying. There's only so much time in the day, but Vaughn vows to do his best to do both. D accepts his decision and says that at the very least, he will instruct Vaughn personally for his sword lessons. Vaughn is intimidated by this guy's determination, so he tells D to just go easy on him with the training. D assures him that he will, as he says that he hasn't forgotten that Vaughn is still a kid. D is really eager to teach him some fighting, so something tells Vaughn that the sword training will be pretty intense. Vaughn ends up being right, as D's training has Vaughn swinging his sword hundreds of times. He tells Vaughn to do 100 upswings and 100 mid-sweeps over and over again. The training is absolutely relentless, and it seems to never end. Eventually, Vaughn finds a moment to catch his breath, and he can't help but call D a demon. D isn't done though, as he notices that Vaughn isn't really doing anything on his break. He can't have that, so he tells Vaughn that he should rest in a squatting position instead of using a chair. D is getting pretty crazy, so Vaughn thinks that he might not be a demon after all, and he might just be an idiot. Just then Till arrives to give our hero a towel. Vaughn acknowledges that his life has been pretty rough, but every day has been fun since he was reincarnated. As he looks at the people around him, Vaughn says that he feels a satisfaction that he never experienced in his past life. Vaughn doesn't want to take any of this for granted, so he determines that he must enjoy this fun life he has in this world to the fullest. A while later, Vaughn goes over what has happened so far. After being reincarnated, he became regarded as a prodigy by the time he was 6. Every day he went through his grueling studies and swordplay training. One day, Vaughn's body even gives out mid-studying, and Till says that he seems really worn out. It has been the same thing day after day, and it's getting to be too much for him. Vaughn realized that at this rate, he was never going to get to enjoy his new life. That is why he now tells Till that he wants to go outside and play. She wonders if there's anywhere he would like to go, so Vaughn thinks it over. He eventually decides to go to the market, so they head there immediately. While there, Vaughn thinks about how he isn't exactly on good terms with his brothers. They're all very competitive, because whoever ends up being the strongest among them will take over as the head of the family. Vaughn knows that he has to be careful, because if he stands out too much as a prodigy, his brothers might try to end his life. If things keep going the way they are, Vaughn knows that he won't be able to enjoy his life in peace. That is why Vaughn has decided to become a slacker, so he can be a normal child instead of a prodigy. Vaughn now enjoys himself as he notices that there's so much activity in the market. It's the biggest market in the city, and it's right next to the Chamber of Commerce. This company is huge, and it has branches all over the kingdom. Just then, Vaughn hears a loud noise in the distance, and he sees that it's coming from someone yelling at a tied-up kid. The guy tells everyone to stop looking at them because he isn't putting on a show, and he is shocked when Vaughn's guards prepare themselves. Vaughn stops them, and he asks the man why the boy he's with is tied up. The man explains that this boy is his son, and he can do whatever he wants with him. Vaughn is startled by this answer, and the man explains that he is here to sell his son into slavery. This confuses Vaughn, so Till explains how things are here. For a long time now, poor families have sold children they can't feed into slavery to earn money to live on. Vaughn thinks about how appalling this is, and he wonders what he can do. Just then, some woman comes out of nowhere, and she wonders if Vaughn is the youngest son of Marquise. Till confirms that he's the young prodigy, and she even shows the woman his family crest. The woman is delighted because everyone has been talking about Vaughn, and she welcomes him to the Chamber of Commerce. Her name is Rosalie, and she says that they have everything Vaughn could ever want inside this place. Vaughn immediately points to the kid, and he explains that he's going to be sold into slavery. Vaughn wants to know how much he will go for, so Rosalie takes a look at him. She wonders if the kid has any magical aptitude, so the man explains that he's capable of using thieving magic. That's not very valuable, so Rosalie explains that they wouldn't pay any higher than 3 large silvers for him. Unfortunately, this makes the man furious, and he takes his anger out on his son. He says that he is worthless, and he calls his son a useless brat. The man drags him away as he plans to try and sell him at a different shop, but he is stopped in his tracks. A voice comes out of nowhere saying that he will purchase the boy, and everyone is shocked to see that it's Vaughn. The man is taken aback as Vaughn offers to buy him for 5 silver, and Vaughn instructs Till to get the money. They pay the man the 5 silver, and the guy doesn't even hesitate to leave his son behind. Vaughn wonders if the kid is okay, but the kid doesn't even say a single word. Vaughn removes the rope that was tying him up, and the kid snaps out of his shock. Vaughn introduces himself, and the kid reveals that his name is Kamson. Vaughn happily explains to him that he's free now, so he can go anywhere he wants. Till is surprised because she thought Vaughn bought him to be a slave, but that isn't it at all. Vaughn just felt like he needed to help the kid, so that is what he did. He wonders if Kamson has anywhere to go, but once again he goes silent. Vaughn can tell that he doesn't, so he asks him if he would like to come with them. Vaughn's guards see a problem with this because they doubt that Marquise will allow a child of unknown origin into the mansion. It would be different if Vaughn brought him back as a slave, so Vaughn determines that he has no other choice. He wonders if that would be okay with Kamson, and Kamson says that he doesn't mind. That's fantastic news, so Vaughn says that it's time to find him some proper clothes. Vaughn realizes that he isn't the best at this, so he asks Rosalie if she will help them. Rosalie's happy to have their business, but first she says that they should finalize the slave contract. She then takes both of their hands and begins the process. This puts a seal on both their hands, and it acts as their slave contract. It cannot be removed, and the seal will remain as long as the contract isn't nullified. Rosalie says that she will waive the contract fee because this is their first time doing business with each other, so Vaughn thanks her. Rosalie is stunned for a moment, but she remembers that it's time for work. As she runs to get started, Rosalie can't believe that she was actually thanked by a noble. Vaughn is glad to finally have everything settled, so he takes Kamson to get fixed up. A while later, we see that Kamson looks like a different person as he informs Vaughn that Dee is looking for him. Vaughn offers to give Kamson a cookie if he tells Dee that he isn't here, but Kamson points out that Dee already knows he's here. Kamson feasts on the cookie anyway, and Vaughn wonders where his gloves are. Kamson explains that he doesn't need them, but Vaughn wonders if he's really okay with showing his slave seal. Kamson isn't just okay with it, he's actually proud of the seal. He declares that it symbolizes his friendship with Vaughn, so he likes to show it off. Vaughn points out that he bought those gloves for him, so Kamson throws everything he just said out the window, and he puts the gloves on. Just then, Dee arrives in search of Vaughn, but Kamson tells him that Vaughn isn't here. Dee says that someone saw Vaughn come into this room, but Kamson says that he must be mistaken. Kamson declares that he can't be sure, but he believes that the person just hallucinated because of their strong feelings for Vaughn. Dee's investigation isn't done, as he notices the cookie crumbs on Kamson's face that were not there before. Kamson denies that they were ever there, but Dee saw him wipe them away. Dee is done with the games, as he determines that Vaughn must have bribed Kamson to lie. Dee's impressed by Kamson's boldness for lying right to his face, so he decides that he will train Kamson in Vaughn's place. Kamson can't believe it, but there's nothing he can do, as Dee takes him to begin their sword training. Vaughn sees that it's safe to come out, and he can only apologize to Kamsin for letting him take the fall. A while later, we see that the entire kingdom is talking about Vaughn. He has finally turned 8 years old, which means it's time to appraise his magical aptitude. All of his brothers have an aptitude for either fire or wind magic, and everyone is sure that Vaughn will possess fire magic. Everyone's looking forward to seeing Vaughn's results, and they all hope the best for him because he's so nice to everyone. Unfortunately, the story takes a very dark turn as Marquise hears about the results of Vaughn's aptitude test. It reveals that Vaughn has no aptitude for any of the 4 elemental magics, and Marquise is furious. The news gets even worse as Marquise is told that Vaughn's aptitude is actually for production magic. Vaughn is terrified by his father's reaction, and tension begins to fill the entire room. This is the worst possible outcome, as Marquise explains that production magic is known as the most unfortunate type of all. It allows its user to create swords and accessories by preparing materials and visualizing the result in their mind. The problem is that it consumes a lot of mana, and those things can be produced without magic anyway, so production magic is practically useless. Besides that, Marquise wonders how Vaughn is supposed to protect the people of this nation with that kind of magic. Marquise says that his late wife Mira was a powerful fire mage, and so was he. Their power was passed down to their other sons, so Marquise can only wonder how he and his wife gave birth to a useless production mage. Vaughn is the last child Mira left him before her passing, so Marquise is furious. He has a terrifying moment of clarity as he realizes that he was a fool for getting his hopes up. Vaughn displayed some very rare talents despite his young age, so Marquise let himself think that Vaughn would become something more. It's clear now that he was wrong, and Marquise can't believe that his house produced such a disgraceful failure. Marquise has taken hold of his sword, so Vaughn realizes just how dangerous the situation is. His father only cares about the strength of their family, so Vaughn begins to panic as he can tell that his father is prepared to end his life. Marquise realizes what he must do, so he raises his sword before his son. Vaughn can only watch in horror as he's completely defenseless, and he desperately tries to think of a way out of this. Just then, before Marquise can strike him down, Mercia steps in to stop him. Marquise demands to know what the meaning of this is, so Mercia explains that he has an idea. There is a remote village that remains undeveloped due to its location, but it's still part of their domain. Mercia has a plan for this place, so he suggests that they leave the area to Vaughn. Marquise knows about this nameless village, but he wonders why Mercia thinks that this is a good idea. Mercia begins his explanation by saying that the village has just over 100 residents. Nothing special ever comes out of there, but the magical resources in the nearby mountains are very powerful. This village is part of the territory that Marquise gained when he was promoted, but it sits between 2 countries that are at war with each other. This territory of theirs has some loyalty issues, so they would benefit greatly if they sent Vaughn there to gain trust. It's incredibly dangerous in the village because it's surrounded by the war going on, and it's under constant attacks from monsters. It's also an impossible place to defend, and it's practically a death trap. Marquise was going to end Vaughn's life anyway, so Mercia thinks he could at least make use of Vaughn by sending him to the village. Marquise likes the idea, so he puts his sword away and declares that Vaughn will become the lord of that village. He tells Mercia that he did a good job because he was able to find a good use for the useless Vaughn. Vaughn is absolutely shocked as they leave, and Mercia apologizes. He couldn't bear to see anything horrible happen to Vaughn, so he made the rash proposal. Vaughn is being sent somewhere dangerous, so Mercia says that he's free to hate him if he wants. Vaughn points out that he wouldn't be alive right now if it wasn't for Mercia, so he's actually very grateful. Mercia promises to do whatever he can to help him, so the 2 brothers shake hands. The next morning, Till says that she doesn't care about the results of some dumb test. Even without magic, Vaughn is still a wise and upstanding noble in her eyes. She is furious about Vaughn being sent to a remote village, and she calls it outrageous. Vaughn thanks her for worrying about him, but he says that right now he's looking forward to it. A lord of a rural town won't have much to do, so Vaughn looks forward to having more free time. If things go well, Vaughn believes that he will finally be able to live a fun and laid-back life. He's really optimistic, as he declares that he will turn it into a place that he really likes to live in. Unfortunately, the king couldn't care less about Vaughn now, so he's being sent without any knights. The only people that will be going with him are 10 adventurers that Mercia hired. At first, they were only going to let him take Kamsin with him, but Vaughn knows that it would have been terrible for them. Luckily, his brother kept that from being the case, so he can only thank Mercia. Just then, Till arrives to remind Vaughn that she is his personal maid, which is why she will be coming with him. Dee appears out of nowhere and reveals that he will be coming as well. He still plans to teach Vaughn everything he knows about the sword, and nothing's going to stop him. It's a very kind gesture, but Vaughn can't help but think how he's going to put him through more training. Just then, Esparta's the next to say that he's coming with because he just retired as a butler. He has decided to supervise Vaughn's studies for fun during his retirement, and Vaughn can't believe that everyone is joining him. As they leave, Till points out that Vaughn has a big smile on his face. Vaughn didn't realize it at first, but now he can tell that he was really anxious about going out on his own. Vaughn then thinks about how the family crest isn't on this carriage because Marquise wanted to send him away without anyone knowing. Vaughn fully expects this to be a sad departure from his home, but a little girl comes out of nowhere to say goodbye. It turns out that the entire kingdom knows he's leaving, and they have all gathered to wish him farewell. One of these knights explains that Dee was upset after hearing that Vaughn was being sent away in secret. They couldn't do anything about him being sent away, so Dee wanted to at least make sure that his departure was a grand one. Vaughn points out that no one was supposed to know about this, but there's no way to tell Dee that because the soldier says that he's asleep right now. He can't even tell everyone to go away, so Vaughn will have no choice but to accept everyone's kind farewell. Just then, Vaughn is shocked as he sees that Dee isn't actually asleep and he's getting the crowd hyped up to say goodbye. The departure's more grand than Vaughn could have ever expected, as they tell him to take care of himself, and Vaughn says goodbye to everyone. On the way to the village, Vaughn tries out his power for the first time. He's able to turn a twig into a small dagger, and he explains that this is what production magic is. Vaughn figured he would start trying it out here and there, just in case he ends up needing it. He has an aptitude for it, and he hopes there's a good way to make use of it. They have been traveling for some time now, so Till says that they should be arriving at the village soon. Vaughn tells Kamsin that if he ends up not liking the village, he can return to the manor. They have a slave contract, but Vaughn doesn't want to force him to live in the village. He says that he can release Kamsin from the slave contract, and he would tell Murica to make sure that he's treated right. Kamsin of course declines the offer, as he declares that he's already decided to dedicate his life to Vaughn. It doesn't matter what kind of danger they're ever in, Kamsin's determined to protect him. Just then the carriage comes to a sudden stop, and Arb frantically explains that the village is under attack. Dee sees the culprits behind the attack and determines that they must be bandits or washed up mercenaries. He is sure that they're experienced fighters, so Vaughn assesses the situation. The village is surrounded by a tall fence, but it's ineffective against arrows. Dangerous looking men are attacking from the front gate, so Vaughn determines that the villagers have to keep up their turtle-like defense. There are about 50 enemies, and Vaughn's group has way less numbers. Dee asks Vaughn for permission to join the battle, because if they all attack together, they should be able to defeat the bandits. The adventurers that Murica hired disagree, as they think it's too dangerous. The enemy outnumbers them by a wide margin, and they would just be throwing their lives away. Dee recognizes this guy as Ortho the Adventurer, and he says that he's aware of the danger. He already knows that they will take some losses, but he is sure that they can drive the bandits away. Ortho points out that the adventurers were only hired to guard Vaughn until they reached the village, and he would never accept a quest that risked the lives of his comrades. Dee doesn't back down, as he explains that this village is Vaughn's first territory. The villagers are his first citizens, so they must draw their swords to protect them from danger. Ortho admires his chivalry, but he explains that it has nothing to do with adventurers like them. Dee is furious, but he knows that he can't force them to fight. Instead, he just asks them to at least protect Vaughn, and he says that they can run away if things take a turn for the worst. Ortho agrees to do this, but Esparta is now the one to object. If Dee's life is taken in battle, the village will have no future, even if they take control. He says that they can't risk that, so Dee can only wonder what Esparta thinks they should do. Esparta reminds everyone that while he did serve as a simple butler at the mansion, he is still an elemental mage. He assures them that they can count on his combat prowess, but the adventurers find it hard to believe that this guy can fight. Esparta just goes right into explaining his plan by saying that he will first create a defensive wall. It will serve as a shield, so he asks the adventurers to fire ranged attacks from behind it. Once the enemy's focus is on the ranged attackers, Dee and his men will charge him from the flank. They are severely outnumbered, but a sequence of surprise attacks will improve their chances of victory. Vaughn wonders if Esparta is really planning to stay behind and fight, so Esparta reveals that this was always his plan. If he doesn't act as a decoy and continue attacking from behind the wall, then Dee and his men will lose their lives for nothing. Vaughn is still against it because he is sure that Esparta will lose his life in battle, but Esparta doesn't waver. He declares that this is one last chance to show off his old man strength, and he pleads for Vaughn to allow him this selfish request. Vaughn admires his determination, but he points out that Esparta has contributed so much to his family. Vaughn refuses to let his life end in a place like this, and he says the same for Dee and his men. If they lose their expert strategist Esparta and their best fighter Dee, then it will be impossible for them to develop this land. If Vaughn fails this mission, he's sure that his father will take his life. Vaughn can't allow any of this to happen, so he declares that he will be the one to act as a decoy. Everyone is shocked by his decision, until immediately refuses. She would rather do it herself, and Kamsen says the same thing. Vaughn appreciates what they're trying to do, but Till is very precious to him, and he doesn't want to see her life ended. The same goes for Kamsen, especially because he should be free right now and enjoying his life. Vaughn has already made his decision, so he declares that he will ride the carriage into the battle and attack head-on. That way the rest of their group can attack from range on both flanks. Dee tries to stop him once more, but Vaughn reminds him of something. He did sword training with him every day, so he won't lose his life easily. Vaughn says that even if he were to lose his life here, he can't think of a better end for a lord than sacrificing his life for his people. Vaughn's speech is incredibly inspiring, and Ortho's completely shocked by Vaughn's determination. Ortho hated the idea of guarding a noble when he first heard about the mission, because he believed that there were no good men among the upper nobility. He was sure that they all looked down on adventurers and common folk, so none of them were worth protecting. The only reason he accepted the quest was because he wanted to keep getting high-paying jobs from the guild, so he had no choice. Ortho was surprised when Vaughn arrived to greet the adventurers when he heard that they would be the ones guarding him. Vaughn politely introduced himself and thanked them for their service. The other adventurers pointed out how wrong Ortho was when he said that there were no good nobles, because Vaughn was clearly a polite young man. After Vaughn left, the other adventurers were relieved to see that they would be guarding an ordinary kid. Even Ortho had to admit that he was wrong, as he realized that not every noble was the same. Vaughn is a good kid, and seeing how determined he is to protect his village has changed Ortho's mind. Ortho marches forward and says that just this once, he will entrust their lives to Vaughn. Vaughn tries to stop him, but Ortho interrupts him. A child saying that he's willing to risk his life can't be ignored, and Ortho wouldn't be able to face his comrades if he didn't do something. His comrades are on the exact same page as they realize how wrong they were before. They used to ridicule the idea of a noble having resolve because the nobles they've met until now were all talk. Vaughn, on the other hand, was ready to put his life on the line, and everyone's inspired. Vaughn had no idea that he was having this kind of effect on Pluriel and the others, and Pluriel can only laugh because Vaughn even took the time to memorize the names of adventurers like them. It's those kind of things that Vaughn does that makes them feel like they can trust him with their lives. Dee is next to step up as he declares that he and his men are noble knights in service of the royal family. Protecting Vaughn here and now means defending the future of the house. Esparta joins in by saying that he cannot condone Vaughn using such an irresponsible strategy. He will fight with the others, but once the enemy is dealt with, he will have to teach Vaughn the responsibility he bears as a potential heir to the royal family. Esparta joins Dee and Ortho on the front lines and says that he will amend his strategy. First, he will create a defensive wall and fire ranged attacks. Then Dee's men will take the left flank, while Ortho's group charges in from the right. Everyone's ready, so Esparta immediately creates the wall. It's up in the blink of an eye, and the adventurers say that they didn't expect the old butler to be such a powerful mage. They're also still impressed by Vaughn, and Ortho even says that he would welcome him becoming the king. The bandits, meanwhile, haven't noticed the giant wall that Esparta put up behind them. They're too focused on conquering the village, and they are sure that it will be a cakewalk. This isn't the case, however, as arrows begin to rain down on them, and several of the bandits are eliminated. They finally notice that the arrows are coming from behind the wall, so their leader declares that they will attack whatever's behind it. The bandits go charging in, but Dee appears to start wiping them out. He runs through their group with incredible force and eliminates several of them with his blade. Ortho's right there with him, and Dee says that everything's going as planned. The enemy fell for their decoy, and they were able to surprise them from both flanks. The battle's really heating up now, so Ortho tells his men not to let the knights show them up. The knights and the adventurers are charging in from both flanks, so the bandits realize that they're surrounded. The bandits still have a number advantage, but our heroes make up for it with pure skill. The terrifyingly powerful Dee tells his enemies to step forward if they want their lives ended, so the bandits start running away from him. Just then the bandit leader rushes towards the wall, and Ortho realizes that he's targeting the people on the other side. Ortho desperately calls out for someone to stop him, but it's too late. The bandit leader has made it past the wall, where he finds a defenseless Pluriel. He prepares to end her life, but Vaughn manages to get his attention. Vaughn maneuvers his way to the guy's back, and he cuts him down with his blade. Kamsen then follows up Vaughn's attack and puts an end to the bandit leader's life. The battle isn't over yet though, as Vaughn says that there's a good chance that the enemy will focus on their position. He tells everyone to pay attention to what's in front of them, and Pluriel can only wonder how Vaughn can be so composed. The battle ends a while later, and Arthur reviews the situation. The enemy took huge losses, while Vaughn and his group suffered no casualties. This is the best possible outcome, and it's a complete victory. Once Ortho receives payment, their quest will be complete and they can leave. However, Ortho says that he has become curious about Vaughn's potential. He knows that there won't be much money in it, but he wonders what his group thinks about staying in this village for a while. Some of the adventurers would rather go on another quest, so they leave, but Ortho and his men stay behind. Pluriel is especially interested in staying because Vaughn saved her life and she wants to repay him. The others were really impressed by how Vaughn carried himself on the battlefield, and they can't believe he's only 10 years old. He's also much nicer than any other noble they have ever met, so they're all eager to see what this village becomes under Vaughn's leadership. Ortho wonders if they're all ready to stay here to help Vaughn, and they all agree. Meanwhile, Till scolds Vaughn for putting his life in danger. She is furious and she demands for him to let her risk her life first next time. Dee arrives to congratulate Vaughn on a job well done, and Vaughn says the same back to the commander. As for Esparta, he senses that the villagers have gathered near the entrance. Vaughn remembers that this is their first time here, so he prepares to meet everyone. Inside the village, Till notices that this place has a lot more space than she imagined. Vaughn introduces himself to the village chief named Rhonda, and Rhonda thanks him for saving their village. Unfortunately, these attacks have happened before, and they have been attacked several times this year alone. Vaughn can only wonder why this village is being targeted, so Rhonda explains their past. Back when they were part of Fredinato County, knights patrolled the area to protect them. Unfortunately, that all went away when the village became part of the territory that Vaughn's father controls. Vaughn can only apologize to them, as he explains that his father has not been informed about the status of the smaller villages yet. Rhonda is terrified by this statement because it makes it seem like the smaller villages are not worth protecting. They practically pay nothing in taxes, so he fears that is why the king doesn't care about them. Vaughn tries to calm them down by saying that complaining about the state of the kingdom won't do any good, but it just makes things worse. The villagers don't want to hear that kind of talk from a noble because he can't possibly understand how hard things are for them. Vaughn tries to calm them down again by explaining that his main concern is the future of this village. He admits that nobles have their flaws and they're to blame for passing laws that don't benefit the smaller villages. Unfortunately, they can't do anything about that right now, so Vaughn says that they should focus on thinking of ways to protect this village. Vaughn has already thought it over, and he has come up with 3 measures that they can take. First, Vaughn says that they need to produce something so valuable that the kingdom can't ignore this village. Then they need to regularly earn enough money to hire mercenaries. Lastly, they need to improve and develop the village themselves. The villagers say that they've come up with ideas like that before, but it's always easier said than done. Vaughn acknowledges that it must have been difficult before, but he declares that things will be different now because their new lord has arrived. This village is all he cares about now, so he will do everything he can to defend and develop it. His inspiring words have no effect on the villagers, so Vaughn can tell that they don't trust him yet. Just then, Esparta introduces himself and explains that he has served the king as his head butler for many years. He vouches for Vaughn by explaining that he has been entrusted with land at the age of 8 after being considered a prodigy. Dee introduces himself next by saying that he's the deputy commander of the king's knights, and he also vouches for Vaughn. The villagers are in shock because the king's head butler and deputy commander have come to their village. They're clearly very important people, so they can only wonder what they're doing here. Rhonda wonders if Vaughn being a prodigy means he can use elemental magic, so Vaughn reveals that he can. He says that it's only production magic though, so they shouldn't expect too much from him in combat. It's clear that the villagers are disappointed to hear this, but Vaughn says that he just hasn't figured out his powers yet. Just then, one of the villagers brings up the problem with taxes. So far, it's been an incredible struggle to give 30% of their harvest, and it's been having a terrible effect on the village. Vaughn wastes no time in fixing this, as he says that they can cut it down to 10% for a while. He has a lot of plans for this village, so it's important to secure a stable way of life first. The villagers are shocked to hear that the taxes will be lowered, and it's a huge relief. Vaughn declares that it's time to get started, and they will begin by strengthening the village's defensive walls. He wonders if Esparta's earth magic wall is long-lasting, but unfortunately it's not. It maintains its integrity while active, but when the mana fades, it becomes a simple mound of dirt. Vaughn determines that they will have to replace the wall with something sturdier, but they need something in the meantime. It will only be a temporary measure, so he asks Esparta to create a wall of dirt for them. Esparta does it immediately, and all the villagers are amazed by his incredible power. Vaughn also wants to build a moat to slow down any intruders, so Dee tells him to leave the job to the knights. Vaughn really has the attention of the villagers now, so he tells them that everyone's cooperation is vital right now. If they all stand together, this village can be reborn even stronger than before. A while later, Till wonders what Vaughn is doing out in the woods. He explains that he was thinking of testing out his production magic, so he has gathered a pile of wood. As he tries his magic, Vaughn notices that he can feel a warmth slowly growing in the pit of his stomach. Vaughn walks himself through the process of using production magic by reminding himself to focus on controlling his mana. Once the mana reaches his fingertips, he must sense every fiber of the wood. Then he will spin them together to make them stronger, like plied thread, before weaving the fibers even more tightly to make a block of wood. The process is a complete success, as Vaughn creates the block, but the others can only wonder what it is. Vaughn explains that it's a fiber block, and he compares it to how microfiber is made. Unfortunately, microfiber only exists in his old world, so the others have no clue what he's talking about. A while later, Ortho comes strolling by, and he's shocked when he sees what Vaughn has been up to. Till explains that Vaughn made these blocks, and the adventurers can't help but notice how many there are. Ortho touches one of them, and notices that they're lighter and harder than he expected. Vaughn gives him permission to cut one in half, but Ortho finds that he can't even scratch it with his blade. Ortho says that he swung at it hard enough to cut through a stone, but this block Vaughn created is incredibly tough. None of them have ever seen anything like it before, and they all wonder if it's really just made of wood. Vaughn is pleased with what he created, and he determines that these blocks could be surprisingly useful. A while later, Till wonders if Vaughn has exhausted his mana yet, because he's been creating all sorts of weapons and tools. Vaughn says he feels fine, and he doesn't understand why production magic has such a bad reputation. He heard that the mana consumption of production magic is really intense. Supposedly, it consumes so much mana that it's almost impossible for most people to make even just one thing. Vaughn doesn't know the full potential of his power yet, but what he does know is that he can easily create weapons. Kamsen really likes the sword Vaughn just made, so Vaughn tells him he can have it. Kamsen promises to cherish it forever, and Till eagerly waits to see what Vaughn will give her. Vaughn hands her an axe, but she isn't very excited about it. Vaughn wonders if there's something wrong with it, so Till tells him that she only went quiet because she was entranced by the weapon's beauty. Vaughn can tell that she doesn't like it, so he thinks about making her a nice accessory later. That night, Vaughn thinks about how his body's sore from all the traveling. They've hardly had any breaks, but worst of all, Vaughn hasn't been able to bathe. Vaughn is sure that the others are tired as well, because they've only been camping this entire time. They can't keep living like this, so Vaughn decides that they need to secure their basic needs before strengthening the village's defenses. Vaughn thinks about what would be the best thing to make first, and he determines that they should make a house. The next day, Rhonda wonders what our heroes are doing, so Vaughn reveals that they're building a home for themselves. This spot used to be a public square, but it hasn't been used in the longest time. There's a lot of space, so Rhonda says that it's the perfect place for Vaughn's mansion. Vaughn is finally ready, so he determines that it's time to find out if he can actually make something as large as a house. Vaughn gathers all his focus and determines that he must start with the 4 pillars that will go in each corner. The pillars require fine wires to go deep into the ground so that they can have a strong foundation. After that comes the floors and the walls to connect the pillars. Finally, after all that, Vaughn finishes up his home with the roof. Vaughn declares that he's finished, and everyone's in complete disbelief. The villagers begin to gather, and the adventurers wonder what just happened. Till explains that Vaughn just built a house for them to live in, but they can't believe that he did it in such a short time. The knights and the adventurers couldn't be happier with their new home, and everyone gets a good look as the dust finally settles. Vaughn doubted himself at first because everyone told him that production magic is useless, but he realizes now that his magic is actually very useful. Vaughn looks at the beautiful home he created for him and his friends, and he can't help but wonder if he made it a little too big. No one can believe that Vaughn made a giant house so fast, and they determine that his production magic is better suited for governing a territory than elemental magic. Vaughn agrees that it's an interesting skill, but he still thinks that offensive magic is still best for protecting people. He is sure that people would feel much safer living under the protection of a powerful lord, but his friends assure him that that isn't the case. Esparta says that he would be correct in times of war, but what people seek is simply a lord who will improve their lives. In that way, Esparta says that no one is better suited than Vaughn. What Vaughn just did was incredible, and Ortho has determined that Vaughn's powers far exceed those of regular production magic users. Vaughn isn't done, as he says that if they bring him the lumber, he can even make houses for everyone else. Everyone is stunned to hear this, so Ortho and Dee tell their men to hurry and gather the materials. The villagers all want homes as well, and Vaughn quickly realizes that he doesn't know what he got himself into. Their homes are in really bad shape though, so Vaughn decides that he will start by dramatically renovating the people's lives in the village. Vaughn agrees to make everyone a home, so they all celebrate. Vaughn finishes making a bunch of houses, and everyone's amazed by his huge mana capacity. His extensive knowledge in how to construct a neighborhood is also very impressive, and Vaughn explains that it's called a grid plan. It has a 4-home block as its fundamental unit, and large streets run between the blocks. Vaughn says that these homes should work for now, but when they eventually obtain lots of stone, he will rebuild each home to better suit its residents. Vaughn also built a bath next to his mansion simply because he wanted to bathe. He went with a simple design for the bathtub, and Pluriel used her water magic to fill the tub. That night after taking a bath, Vaughn finally gets to sleep in a nice comfy bed. The next day, Vaughn is told that thanks to the knights, they now have a trench around the village. Vaughn is very pleased with this, but it would be ideal for their defenses to fill it with water and make it a moat. Beyond that, they will need water for drinking and for use in the bath. This makes it clear what their next job should be, so Vaughn declares that it's time to find a water source. They quickly diverted water from a nearby river with the help of Esparta's great powers. He instantly dug a trench a few meters long, while Dee and the others extended it by hand. Vaughn followed behind to strengthen the bottom and the sides of the trench. There's a lot of distance between the river and the village, so Till says that it's quite the project. It can't be helped though, as Vaughn points out that people need water. It's hard work, but having everyone pulling toward the same goal is pretty fun. Furthermore, once conditions are improved and less uncertain for people, it'll be easier for merchants to visit. This will be essential because it's the only way Vaughn will be able to live his laid-back life in the future. Vaughn determines that this job will take at least a week, but he's shocked when the workers point out that they can already see the village from where they are. Vaughn decides to call it a day for now, but Dee says that they will reach the village in a few hours if they keep going. Dee is eager to keep working, but Vaughn points out that the others are ready to pass out. Dee considers this to be a new kind of training, but he realizes that he can't push too far. The next day, Vaughn announces to everyone that they have finally completed the canal to carry the water to the village. He thanks everyone for their hard work, and he tells Esparta to open the water gate. Water comes flowing in, and all the villagers are amazed. The moat around the village is complete, and now it'll really be difficult for the bandits to attack the village walls. Vaughn fears that the moat will flood when it rains, so he wonders if he should create a lake behind the village too. Esparta thinks it's a good idea because that lake could be used as a reservoir that will be useful during droughts. Vaughn does that next, and the villagers can't believe that so much is happening. The village that once had no waterways now has a lake for a reservoir. Thanks to Vaughn, the villagers don't have to trek to the river every single day just to fetch water. The chief thanks him, but Vaughn says it's not necessary. He's glad that everyone has access to water now because life will be much easier for the entire village. That night, we see that a girl referred to as Lady Art is traveling with someone named Panamera. Panamera says that it's still a long way to a certain remote village, so she tells Art to get some rest. The next day, Vaughn finishes creating a giant defensive wall called the Rampart. The village wall used to just be a wall of dirt, but now it's an incredible construction. Ramparts have a wide top, so guards can even patrol on top of the wall. Everyone is really excited about this, because with a rampart this sturdy, the villagers can rest easy, even when bandits strike. Vaughn shocks everyone when he says that he isn't satisfied with this, because he wants to make the villagers feel even safer. Vaughn tries out making some basic crossbows, and everyone is stunned when he's finished. They say that these things aren't basic at all, and they're super impressive. Vaughn even attached shields to the front of them, so the guards can fire arrows while protected from enemy attacks. This is really stunning, and it's clear now that Vaughn can make all sorts of things with his production magic. Their village is relatively small, but Vaughn is pleased because it's starting to look like a fortress city. Everyone agrees, and they say that mere bandits will never conquer it, no matter how hard they try. Dee is sure that if the king knew what Vaughn could do with his power, he would have made him the head of the house instead of banishing him to this remote village. The king thought that Vaughn was weak, but one look at what he has done to this village makes it clear that his power is more than sufficient for combat. Dee would argue that Vaughn is more powerful than anyone, but Esparta believes that his power is best for protection. The two begin to argue, but Vaughn settles them down. He says that they shouldn't get frustrated over their circumstances. They all just have to make do and fight with what they've got. Just then, Vaughn's stomach rumbles, so Till makes him a meal. It wasn't easy though, because they're short on ingredients. Esparta says that the defense of the village is important, but they must do something about the village's regular income. This village has no connections, aside from a few merchants who come here once a month. Vaughn doesn't think that this needs to be a priority, because the village's crops are able to provide plenty of food for the village. However, Esparta points out that they don't have the ingredients to make Vaughn's favorite sweet-baked desserts, and Vaughn completely changes his mind. Not having those sweets is horrifying to him, so Vaughn declares that it's time to come up with something this village can sell. Kamson thinks they should sell those wood blocks Vaughn can make, but Vaughn rejects the idea. Selling them wouldn't work, because only he can work with them. Everyone gives their suggestions, but Vaughn can tell that coming up with something to sell that is unique to this village will be difficult. Later, Vaughn learns that Till and Kamsen don't want to use their weapons. They were gifts from Vaughn, so they don't want to cause any damage to them. Vaughn points out that they need to learn how to defend themselves with those weapons, so they need to practice. Zara tells them not to worry, and he shows them his shield of the Orc Knight. It's sturdy and flexible, so it will be easy on their weapons when he blocks with it. Kamsen's first attack doesn't have a single bit of force behind it, but everyone is confused when the shield ends up on the ground. The shield is even cut in half, so everyone is amazed that the weapon was able to do so much damage with such little force. It's technically a wooden sword, so Vaughn is surprised that it was able to cut so well. Till fixes Zara's shield, and Arthur arrives to wonder what all the commotion is about. He has brought some ores that they mined, and he wonders if Vaughn would like to purchase them. Ortho explains that the forests around the nearby mountains are filled with strong monsters, so people have avoided that area. That place hasn't been mined before, which is why they can find a lot of rare ores without even having to go into the mountains. They were able to find iron, copper, silver ores, and even a little bit of gold. Ortho really stuns our hero though, when he reveals that they found mithril ore. This is great news, because if all this was at the foot of the mountains, then the actual mountains must hold a wealth of resources. Vaughn takes some of the iron ore, and he amazes everyone as he turns it into a solid block of iron. He says that he didn't melt it down to make it more pure, so he doesn't know how pure it is. Zara's really excited, so he wonders if Vaughn can make him a sword with it. Vaughn feels bad about what happened to his shield, so he says yes. Zara wants one long sword and one short, so Vaughn gets to work. This is his first time making an iron weapon, so it will take a lot of focus. He thinks hard about its shape and how sharp it must be, and soon he's done. This is Vaughn's first customer, so he paid extra attention to the sword's embellishments. Zara couldn't be happier with the short sword, so Vaughn gets to work on the next one. That one is just as amazing, so of course the other adventurers want weapons too. Vaughn points out that they were the ones to get the ores, so it's only right that he make them weapons. When he's done, everyone is certain that Vaughn can sell these weapons for a lot of money. Vaughn then looks at the mithril ore, and he wonders what the weapons would be like if he made them with mithril. Esparta is very intrigued with the mithril because he has never heard of anyone mining metallic ores in the woods. The only explanation is that there's a dungeon nearby. Esparta tells Vaughn that if they discover a dungeon, their situation would change massively. Hordes of people and goods would begin to flow in and out of this village. This gets Vaughn really excited because if they discover one, the importance of this village would jump dramatically. Dungeons have tons of resources in them, with gems as valuable as national treasures. Normally, when the guild receives words of a new dungeon, they open a branch in the nearest town or village. Unfortunately, Vaughn points out that their village doesn't have the resources to welcome the guild right now. Esparta agrees, because the guild coming here would bring many adventurers, merchants, and even the chivalric order. Right now, their village lacks the facilities, food, and infrastructure to support them. If this news spread, a neighboring nation would attack them, seeking to profit off the dungeon. On top of that, Vaughn points out that he's the black sheep of his family. If his father found out that the village he was sent to actually had value, he would be sent somewhere else. This means that Vaughn needs to grow this village and produce results before discovering the dungeon. Ortho's on the same page, so he says that they will avoid the location where the dungeon is likely to be when they gather resources. Vaughn knows that the adventurers could gain a lot by just reporting this to the guild, so he appreciates that they're holding back for the sake of the village. A while later, Vaughn is pleased with how everything looks, so he says that this concludes their dramatic renovation. Till wonders if Vaughn really isn't out of mana yet, because he has been making tons of houses and weapons. Vaughn says that he's fine, and only feels a bit tired. Just then, a messenger urgently reveals that some armored lizards are approaching the village. Vaughn immediately instructs everyone to get inside the walls and orders for the drawbridge to be raised and the gate to be closed. All the villagers are terrified because they know how dangerous these monsters are, but Vaughn has no fear. He knows that everyone is afraid of battle, but he reminds them that the lives of everyone in this village depend on what they do. Vaughn promises to fight for everyone, but he can't protect them with his strength alone. That is why he tells the villagers to lend him their strength so they can all protect this village together. The villagers are ready to protect their village, so Vaughn instructs them to man the crossbows. Kamsen explains that the adventurers are out hunting, so they're not in the village. In that case, Vaughn decides that he must partake in the battle, but Till stops him. He sees just how serious she is, so he asks Dee to go up the wall and report down to him what's happening. This way he can issue orders from a safe distance, so Dee agrees. Dee is horrified by what he sees, so he reports that there are roughly 40 armed lizards. This is really bad, because even a bunch of veteran knights would struggle to take down just one armored lizard. There's no time to waste, so Vaughn tells Dee to load the crossbows. All the villagers follow Dee's command, and they launch their first attack. The arrows seemingly vanish when they hit the lizards, and Dee realizes that they're going right through them. After a while, they're able to take down 10 of the monsters, and the villagers begin to celebrate. There's still many left though, and they only have 1 bolt left per crossbow. They have no choice, so they fire their last arrows, and they manage to take out another wave of armored lizards. Unfortunately, they're out of iron arrows, and there's still many monsters left. Vaughn struggles to think of a solution, but he comes up with an idea. He tells Dee to use the wooden bolts, but the others fear that it won't do much. The scales on these armored lizards are made of steel, so wooden arrows would never pierce them. Dee tells him not to worry, because Vaughn has already defied his expectations in countless ways. He protected this village from bandits, then developed it at a tremendous pace. Dee won't ever doubt him again, so he has decided to put his faith in Lord Vaughn. The villagers launch the wooden arrows at the beasts, and the knights are shocked to see that the arrows are getting stuck in their heads. They wonder if this really worked, and everyone begins to celebrate as the monsters collapse to the ground. It's clear that the wooden arrows are enough to take the lizards down, so Dee orders for the villagers to keep firing them. He says that they will feast on lizard kebab tonight, and arrows begin to rain down on the monsters. Soon Dee announces that they have won the battle, and all the villagers cheer. Vaughn is given credit for his great decision, and he's just glad that it worked. The knights assess the situation, and they're very impressed. Not only did they avoid any casualties, not a single person on their side was even injured. Their victory was overwhelming, and this makes Dee realize that Vaughn is going to be a big deal. Later, the villagers harvest the giant lizards, and Dee tells everyone to take care when preserving their eyes and fangs. The guts can be thrown out, but they have to be sure to extract the magic cores. The harvesting is going much faster than expected, and it's all because of the incredible knives that Vaughn made. Vaughn arrives to see that they have tons of meat in the village now, which means that they can have a feast. The feast is held that night, and Vaughn gives a toast to their victory. The villagers thought that there would never come a day where they could enjoy themselves in this village, but Vaughn changed all that. The chief is amazed because it's hard to believe that there's a noble that enjoys spending time with lower class villagers. Vaughn's friends tell them that it's normal because it's just the way Vaughn is. Ortho wasn't there for the battle, but the story all made sense when he was told that the wooden arrows were made from the same stuff as their weapons. Just then, Dee overhears them talking about their weapons, so he declares that he will buy one from Vaughn as well. The other knights also want to buy some, but Vaughn says that he could never charge them. Once the village's finances are in order, he will make them all weapons for free. Afterwards, Ortho explains that they could sell the armored lizards to merchants and get 20 gold for each. Unfortunately, most of the meat will spoil, and Vaughn will have to pay for a transport fee. Accounting for that, they will probably be able to get 8 gold for each. There are still 40 of them left, so they will get a little over 300 gold. Vaughn does the conversion, and he's amazed when he realizes that this is about 300 million yen. Unfortunately, Esparta must remind him about something. When a village makes more than 100 gold, it's required to pay 50% in the form of taxes. There's no way to keep it a secret either, because it will be discovered immediately if they try to sell this much at once. That would bring the profit down to 150 gold, but the worst part is that Vaughn's father will learn about how well this village is doing. If he learns that this place has value, then he will exile Vaughn to a different remote area. Esparta comes up with an idea and says that they could try reporting this to Vaughn's brother Mercia. They could give him the glory of defeating the armored lizards, and no one would get suspicious. Later, some merchants arrive at the village, but they wonder if they're at the right place. They have been here before, but it doesn't look like the old remote village that they remember. Vaughn introduces himself as the lord of this village, and they immediately recognize him as the son of Marquise. He is known for being a prodigy, so they wonder what he's doing here. The merchants introduce themselves as Mari and Rango, so Vaughn welcomes them to their village. Inside, the guys are absolutely stunned when they see what Vaughn has to sell them. They are the materials from the armored lizards, and the guys can't believe that they managed to defeat such a huge army. Even adventurers fear these giant monsters, so the guys struggle to believe that this tiny village fought off so many of them. They are eager to buy everything, but they will need about a month to transport it all. Vaughn agrees, because these guys will have to recruit more men for this job. Unfortunately, the meat won't stay good for that long, so Vaughn tells them that they can take some for free. In return, Vaughn would like for them to take a look at some of the weapons they're selling. The guys had no idea that there was a blacksmith in this village, and Vaughn doesn't tell them that it's actually him. The guys are really impressed with the weapons, so they agree to buy them at Vaughn's asking price. Vaughn even takes it a step further by asking if they would promote the weapons as well, but they're hesitant. The guys can tell how incredible these weapons are, so they don't want to share them with any other merchants. Vaughn knows that they just want to make a good profit, so he comes up with an idea. He points out that if they sell the weapons just outside the village, then everyone will figure out where they came from. People will come to the village searching for them, and that could be a good opportunity. This is why Vaughn says that the guy should set up a shop inside the village before they start promoting. They will be doing the hard work of getting the word out about the weapons, and they will have a shop ready for anyone that comes searching for them. The guys wonder if Vaughn would really be okay with that, so Vaughn says that he would. Vaughn builds the shop right away, and the guys are even more amazed. They just finished telling Vaughn what they thought the shop should look like, and he made it in the blink of an eye. Just then, we see that the girls have arrived at the village. Panamera is concerned about something, so she says that she will find out if Vaughn is really a prodigy herself. Inside Vaughn's mansion, Esparta explains that the village is growing at an incredible rate. He believes that more people will come, so they need to build a town that can hold 10,000 people. As they develop the land, they will need plenty of people to guard the village and administer its facilities. Furthermore, Vaughn will have to decide what kind of fortress town they want to be. Square fortress towns are the most common design, but Vaughn has other ideas. He wants to use a star design because attackers will have to spend time conquering the pointy parts to get near the main parts. If they try to ignore them, then they will just end up getting attacked from 3 different angles. Just then, Vaughn is told that an emissary from Ferdinando County has arrived to see him. Panamera introduces herself as a knight, and Art introduces herself as the youngest daughter of Count Ferdinando. Art is here to pay her respects on her father's instructions, so she hopes that they can get along. Vaughn, however, can tell that they're actually here to assess the state of their enemy and possibly win him over. Panamera is impressed with his conclusion because he is right. Vaughn has been entrusted with land between Ferdinando County and the Kingdom of Yelenida, so Ferdinando is wary of him. He fears that Vaughn might spearhead his father's unseemly ambitions. Panamera determines that Vaughn being sent all the way out here means that he doesn't have an aptitude for elemental magic. Vaughn knew that word would get out eventually, so he doesn't deny it. He says that Ferdinando's concerns are unwarranted because he's not planning anything with his father. Vaughn says that he was simply exiled here by his father, but Panamera doesn't believe him at all. She points out that Vaughn has turned this remote village of 100 people into a fortress in a matter of days. She suspects that at least 5,000 men were sent here with Vaughn to accomplish all this because it's their goal to turn this village into a new military outpost. Vaughn shocks her by laughing right in her face, and he can only apologize. She was so serious when saying all that, but there's a huge misunderstanding. Vaughn explains that all his father allowed him to bring was Kamsin and some of his luggage. He says that his family didn't even see him off, and Art is horrified to hear this. Panamera points out that his night butler and maid are here, but they explain that they came on their own. Dee was even ordered to return to the kingdom, but he just ignored it. Esparta says that he's retired, and he just wanted to hang out in a nice village. Till says that Vaughn cares about people more than anyone, which is why she has decided to serve him for the rest of her life. Panamera is still skeptical, so she wonders how the village was able to change so fast. Vaughn determines that it would be best to show them, so he takes them outside. He says that he will make a rampart like the one that surrounds their village, but Panamera can't believe it. She is amazed when Esparta makes it clear that he's a great elemental mage, but this wall won't be enough. Panamera knows that once this wall loses its mana, it will come crumbling down. This is where Vaughn steps in, so he uses his magic to turn the wall of dirt into a rampart. He then uses some of his blocks to create a gate right in front of their eyes. The girls can't believe what they're seeing, and they can only wonder what Vaughn's magical aptitude is. Vaughn explains that he has an aptitude for production magic, and it's not what people think it is. Society calls it the most unfortunate magic of all, but they are wrong. Art is stunned by this, and she has visions of her past. Vaughn explains that the instant his father learned about his aptitude, he drove him out of their home. Panamera calls Marquise a fool because with Vaughn's power, he could have expanded his influence drastically. He exiled him though, and now he doesn't even know about Vaughn's power. Panamera is convinced, so she reveals that the real reason she's here is to offer Art's hand in marriage. Vaughn can tell that Ferdinando wants them to get married, so they can just leave his kingdom alone. Vaughn explains that he plans to continue strengthening and developing this fortress town, but he doesn't seek conflict with anyone. He doesn't want to fight anyone, so there's no need for marriage. Vaughn says that Art wouldn't be happy here anyway, because it's really dangerous. Panamera says that she came here to prevent the marriage, but her feelings have changed. After meeting Vaughn, she would happily welcome him getting married to Art. He possesses great foresight, and he has the power to unite people behind him. She wonders how Art feels about marrying him, and she doubts that she will ever find a better man. Art does think that Vaughn is a good person, but she doesn't know about marrying him just yet. Vaughn hasn't even considered marriage at his age, so they decide to hold off on that. Vaughn is shocked when Panamera reveals that they will be staying here for another day, and she's delighted to see Vaughn acting his age for once. Panamera wonders if Vaughn has a spare room they can stay in, and they're both shocked when Vaughn says that he will make an inn. Vaughn makes the inn immediately, and the girls can't believe their eyes. At dinner, Vaughn wonders what kind of things Art likes. She explains that she likes cute things, like dolls and flowers, but Vaughn hasn't seen much of those. Art offers to show him the one she brought with her, and she's shocked by how interested he is. The others want to see them as well, so Art feels really welcomed here. That night, Art thanks Vaughn for the wonderful day. She was really nervous at first, but seeing how nice he is was a huge relief. Art says goodnight as she runs off, and Vaughn is just glad that he made a good first impression. Back home, Esparta determines that Art was most likely sent here for the same reason Vaughn was. She probably can't use elemental magic, so Vaughn realizes that it was hard for her to say that she was driven away from home just like he was. Vaughn is okay with that, and decides that she can stay in this village if she's not able to return home. That night, Panamera wonders if they should stay a while longer. Art says it's a great idea, and she heads to bed. She thinks about talking to Vaughn the next day, and it's the first time in a long while that she's actually looking forward to waking up. Thanks for watching my recap. Make sure to like the video.